Villarreal-Bueron. We ask that you keep yourself on mute. And if you have a question, please type in the chat and we will call on you to ask during the Q&A. This session is being recorded, which will be uploaded to the conference schedule a little later today. I believe everyone is in so far. So with that, Leslie, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 12th International Conference on the Constructed Environment. It's a great pleasure to me presenting Viviano Villarreal as the speaker of this conference. I'm going to read his bio. Viviano Villarreal-Bueron holds a Bachelor in Architecture from Tec de Monterrey in Mexico, with Masters in Design Theory and Pedagogy from CIARC in Los Angeles, where he graduated with distinction, and his thesis was awarded the Best Postgraduate Thesis Award from 2019. From 2009 to 2015, and prior to establish his own firm, Viviano worked for the Prize Dutch firm OMA, led by architect Rem Koolhaas from their Hong Kong branch office. With offices in Mexico and Hong Kong, in 2015, Viviano establishes Mass Operations, a design studio which understands architecture as a series of operations which will apply to matter-generated space. The office recent projects include the headquarters offices from the Mexican pharmaceutical company, Farmacias del Ahorro, in Monterrey, Mexico, the Barcode Tulum building, the Stair House, and the Chai-Wan Artist Lab in Hong Kong. In addition, Viviano is also in academia, having taught at Hong Kong University and USJ of Macau in Asia. Presently, he's an adjunct professor of architecture at the Universidad de Monterrey, UDEM, and leads the vertical studio of Cátedra Más at the Universidad Autónoma de Nuevo León. Viviano is a chapter member of the National Architecture Academy of Mexico, as well as the Architects Institute of the State of Nuevo León, where he has published several articles of architecture and its pedagogy. Please receive Viviano as a plenary speaker, and welcome, Viviano.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Leslie, for the presentation, and Elizabeth for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see if you can see. It says PowerPoint here.
Yeah,
correct?
I can see the screen, yeah.
Thank you. We're going to just do a little quick audio video test because I have quite a few videos in the presentation. So it should almost feel like we're at the movies, right? Again, thank you for the invitation. The presentation for today, I'm going to try to convince you that I deal with the built environment through this method, through design, which for me is solving problems and generating opportunities. Basically, that's it. So I just kind of reintroduce myself. My name is Viviano Villarreal-Bueron. I have a studio called Mass Operations, where I design architecture from small to large scale. I also teach, and together with another professor of the university, we have a podcast where we talk about architecture and philosophy, because everybody has a podcast today, of course. But I'd like to start this small lecture with a little provocation. I'm not very familiar with all the people that are here. I understand this is not geared as much to students. It's more about professionals that deal with the built environment. So I'm wondering if you have ever thought about what actually architecture is and is not. And I want to share with you two little clips of a conversation of a couple of important, let's say, representatives of the profession.
I mean, architects are not even artists as far as you're concerned.
For the most, absolutely not.
Because?
Are you going to tell me buildings are works of art?
Yes.
Oh, so are people then, and so we have...
No. Are you saying to me that Frank Lloyd Wright never created a single work of art? Whether it's furniture, whether it's...
Oh, furniture's art now. Tree, how about plum? Where do you want to start?
Well, I don't know, but
Art is purposely useless. And that's what makes it more free than buildings.
Okay, but is the difference then?
Look, there are aspects in buildings that you can say deal with the provenance of sculpture or deal with the overlay of painting. But don't start telling me buildings are works of art, because I don't buy it.
So that's Richard Serra having a discussion with Charlie Rose, where Richard Serra is almost about to punch Charlie Rose at the suggestion that architecture can be art and that architects are artists. And a couple of months later, Charlie Rose would interview Renzo Piano, a very well-known architect, and he had this to say about the same discussion.
Architecture is about making shelter for human beings.
That's why Richard thinks it's not art, because it has function.
Yes, but it's also about telling stories. Architecture is also about semantics, it's about allusion, it's about telling stories. Otherwise, it's not architecture. It's only the combination of the materiality of making building and the humanistic side of telling stories that gives sense to a place or to a building. Otherwise, the building has no sound. Otherwise, the building doesn't sing. And did you notice that some buildings sing and others don't?
Yeah.
Some buildings sing, other buildings don't. Some buildings have a soul, some buildings don't. Serra says architecture cannot be art because it has a function. It has to deal with physics, it has to deal with plumbing. But Renzo Piano is here to remind us that without the human aspect about telling story, architecture is merely a construction and is not architecture. And this is an issue that has come up since the Renaissance, when these people here decided to take out the role of the architect and actually the place where the architect studies from being the craft guilds of the medieval times to the academic setting that they created. So they created the first academy where the architect no longer learned in a workshop, but became educated around philosophy and the arts. And that has put us and people like myself as an architect in a big problem. It's a philosophical problem because does architecture need to be built? If we Google what an architect is, we're going to see a person with a hard hat that is around constructions all the time. But actually, for me, it's much more important about the ideas that we have in our heads as architects that may not be manifested, may not be built at the end of the day. And we communicate those ideas through our drawings. That's the only way we can get a building built. It's through drawings, although not all of them will be built, as we know from working in this field. So we're in that setting about what is architecture, what is not architecture. And speaking about function, I like to look at function in art this way. Anytime an object that is designed with a purpose in mind, with functionality, and we strip it away from that purpose, it becomes a piece of art. So this fork no longer functions as a fork, and it's now a piece of art. Anything that was designed with a purpose in mind, when stripped from that purpose or functionality, becomes a piece of art. So I'll come back to this point eventually in the lecture. I split my lecture in 3 different parts. One is before starting the studio. The other one is a little bit of what I do with my students. And finally, a few projects that I want to show you today, which I hope that we have time for a good Q&A session. I'm going to be a little bit quick in the beginning because I don't want to run out of time. I've been teaching since 2009. These are some of my professors. I had a really very lucky experience to have great tutors and professors during my education. And I traveled the world working for different architects. This is in Chile, in South America with Felipe Sadi, where I worked on a couple of houses with his team. In Holland, I worked on a couple other houses and larger scale projects with a team in Amsterdam. And finally, somehow, I managed to arrive in Hong Kong to work for this man, which is Rem Koolhaas. What can I say about Rem? He's a Pritzker Prize winning architect, Golden Lion in Venice, mentioned in the Time most influential people at some point. But I think on the architecture side, here we can see a couple of his most, let's say, prominent buildings. It's much more important what he has to say, the story he has to tell us. So here we see him in The Simpsons, not once, but twice. But in this article, we see the different amount of generations of architects that have come through OMA and then have successfully established their own studios. OMA is also a studio that is constantly talking about the philosophy of what is and is not architecture and what should architecture be. So in that sense, it was almost like a master's degree to go and work for this studio for 5 years out of their Hong Kong office, which I was mostly involved in this building, the Taipei Opera, which is called the Taipei Performing Arts Center. I won't get into the details of the actual concept of the design in detail, but the government asked us to provide 3 different theaters, and we decided to plug them all in one single building, which we call the Magic Cube. And by arranging them in a certain way, we were able to create what we call the super theater, which is a 100-meter long theater, because we saw that most of the interesting contemporary plays were not happening inside theaters because theaters were not big enough to accommodate those plays. So they were happening outside in factory settings or outdoors. So there you see a model of the building in section. There's a team in 2009 where we were notified that we won the competition. I was mostly involved in the facade and the structure of the building. And there we have an image with Rem going to see the project on site. It's scheduled to open its first play this summer. So during the 5 years I was at OMA, I got to go, let's say, up the ranks, and I ended up being business manager as well. So I worked almost on 60 projects while I was at OMA. That's a little bit of my story before starting my studio and my practice. And I want to talk a little bit of what I do with my students. With my students, I started this label called Cátedra Más, which has to do with anything that has to do with teaching design. And with that, I do travel studios with my students. We go to different parts of the world to look at architecture. We visit sites. In this case, we're visiting one of our buildings. And I follow this philosophy. I follow the philosophy of this professor. The idea here is to teach students about design without them realizing they're learning. So you want to keep them confused until there's a moment of revelation where the lesson is at hand. I give all my students these little bracelets, which I've got here right now, and we focus on what Renzo Piano is talking about, the narrative, telling stories through our architecture, trying to solve problems and generating opportunities through a storyline that is manifested in architecture. So here we have a few examples. This is an exercise that I do with my students. It's called graphic narratives, where we take a look at different films from well-known directors, and they try to create a diagram that explains something that could only be explained through a diagram of that movie. So there we see Pulp Fiction and Memento. We also do that not only in flat diagram form as an infographic, but we do it in axonometric form. These are the instruments that architects have in their power to convince clients or people of their design so they can be manifested. It is through these drawings. So we try to connect the idea to the hand, to the computer, and generate a story. So there you saw Space Odyssey 2001 from Kubrick. This is the original Blade Runner. We don't only look at films, we look at texts as well. So these are the texts of Platon, and there are a few other movies. During the pandemic, in the first summer of the COVID-19 pandemic, we morphed this exercise a little bit to turn it back to our city. And we're thinking about the post-pandemic. We were just in the first summer, but we wanted really to get out of it. We thought it was going to be much quicker. And we looked at this. This is Where's Waldo, which are these books that I'm still fascinated by, but I was fascinated as a young kid. And what I told them is that the interesting thing about all the drawings in these books is that they're all axonometrics. Because that's the only way you can tell a story in plan and elevation at the same time. So we looked at that and we turned around to look at our city, and we generated one axonometric view of our city and told 9 different stories about how that city was going to be transformed in the post-pandemic era. So 9 different topics, 9 different speculations of the future in one single axo. So you see one single street corner and the intervention by 18 of my students in 9 different topics. I thought that the lesson here was that instead of everybody doing one single project, one single drawing, creating one drawing that was made in a team form was very poignant to how we were going to get out of this problem of this worldwide pandemic. And now I'm going to get into the practice of the studio. The studio starts in 2015 with a very ambitious idea of having a design studio based in Hong Kong and Mexico at the same time, with only one staff member, me. So the first year, it was really a lot of traveling between Hong Kong and Mexico, trying to get projects. And while I'm doing that, I'm also teaching. So quite a bit of projects got designed in spaces like these. This is a ferry that would take me from Hong Kong to Macau, where I would see my students for 3 hours and then go back. And that was the first office for the studio. Before the pandemic, we were doing video conferencing. We actually loved this program that was called Appear In, which was very good. It was much better than Skype, and Zoom, of course, came and killed that. But this is how we were working back in 2016 to get these projects with multiple time zones between Asia and Latin America, of course. And slowly but surely, the first projects came out of interior designs in Hong Kong and the first architecture projects in Mexico, which started to, of course, are much slower than the interior design projects. So we cover from small to large scale, between interior design all the way to landscape and master planning. And here you can see some of our projects. And again, the idea is to always solve problems through our design or generate opportunities. We do this through the way we work, and it has to do with what our studio is called mass operations. We think that as designers, all we can do is manipulate the mass and matter of materials. So we try to articulate very clear steps, or let's say operations, of what do you do to apply to that mass of the materials that generates the solution in architecture. As I mentioned, the studio starts in Hong Kong. Here you can see the beautiful skyline of Hong Kong Island. And this is where our first project took place, but not on the Hong Kong Island side, but on the Kowloon side, which is far denser, and it's attached to the land piece of China, although it's still Hong Kong, right there. And here the problem was, how could we mix a third generation traditional Indian tailoring shop with the vibrancy and cosmopolitanity of the contemporary city of Hong Kong? But also, how do we deal with a central column in the plan? This is Cameron Road. It was not going to be a ground floor shop front. That's where the original shop was. This was a VIP showroom on top of that. So there was going to be no connection to the street, unfortunately. That was the original, and the new one is there. And when we saw the site, we saw this. It was two commercial units put together, which inevitably leaves a central column. So we took that problem and tried to design around it by creating not just one more column, but a forest of columns around it. At the center, this gives us a central axis, which does give a little bit of a feeling of equal division from both sides, no? And this then gave us the two sides for the two genders, which they have clothes here for. This is a tailoring shop, high-end Indian tailoring shop. So we would have the female side on one side and the male side on the other. That central, let's say, column cloud or column forest then gets perforated to then create exhibition spaces or merchandising spaces, as we can see here. And the effect is that you actually forget about that central column when you see this. It becomes a feature instead of a problem. There were a few other guidelines. We didn't want anything to touch the ground that wasn't wood. So all the garments are hanging from the ceiling, as you can see there. And it's a continuous drop ceiling with this grid that is only perforated by these forest of columns. There you see the back champagne room. The changing rooms are a little bit of an architectural volume within this space. You can see there that we're thinking about architecture much more than interior design, actually. And that was our first project. Closely after that, we had two residential projects in Hong Kong, which I believe, to fully explain, we have to give a little bit of the context of Hong Kong, because the density and the cost of living spaces is insane in the city. So basically you get what is a closet space of 15 square meters. For each meter of those is cost of $25,000. So if you compare that to Europe, the average living space, or Mexico, the average living space and the average cost of that space, it is radically different. This means also that there's not much space to intervene, but also when you do intervene in a space, you need to do it with a very smart allocation of your means and resources. So this might be the postcard of Hong Kong, but this is also the reality of Hong Kong. It is extremely dense. These are famous pictures from a building there that has a central courtyard. That in Hong Kong is a central courtyard. It's where all the AC ducts live. These are a couple of images from artist in Hong Kong that has taken photos from the ceiling of these, it's not a double height, but it's 1.5 height living spaces, which are social housing in Hong Kong, social housing apartments. And there you see kids in the bunk bed doing their homework, and the parents doing the wash and preparing dinner. You see this woman that lives by herself. You can see there's natural light coming to the space, so she has a window. But this man over here was a little bit more of an entrepreneur and decided to divide his minimum living space so that he can rent out the other one. He does have 4 mobile phones, as you can see there. No window, but mobile phones. And yet that is not the minimum living space in Hong Kong. This is. These are what are called there the cage dwellers. And basically, people pay here about $250 a month to rent out what is basically a caged bunk bed. And many of the people living here in this situation are people that were not able to retire economically, and they sleep here among their things that they own, and they go out during the day to work, most probably in recycling metal and other materials. So that is the reality of Hong Kong. Within that, we had 2 residential projects that were lofts. And the lofts are an interesting thing because they are illegal in Hong Kong. So here we see a couple of news bits. The issue is that industrial warehouse spaces that are in the city, because Hong Kong doesn't have factories, are all storage. And now that they're not being used, they become really large spaces at a much cheaper rate that people like to live in, instead of these small, cramped, tiny apartments. The issue is an insurance issue. If you're not legally allowed to live there and you have a little kitchen there and you burn down the building, the insurance company is not going to cover the costs. So that's why it is kept still illegal. The first loft that we were given for this was more of a developer oriented loft. They wanted to fix up the space for rent, for profit. So we didn't know the user, and that was the issue. There was very little budget and we didn't know the user. We couldn't talk to anybody to say, well, what do you like about this? Do you like these finishings? Do you like that kind of a space? So we had to guess what type of user would be living there. And we guess it would be a bachelor. These are the industrial zones where you find these loft spaces in Hong Kong. They're in the periphery. They're not in the main area of, let's say, Hong Kong Island. So it's Chai Wan and Ap Lei Chau. And here you can see the first one. So we went from Raja's Lux showroom to Horizon Plaza back here. As you can see, it's a beautiful setting in front of the ocean. So there we decided to create a space where a bachelor could live, work, and play. Very simple design, as you can see here. A little mezzanine just for your bed. Underneath that, a working space, and then a large living room space. This was the unit as we received it. Cleared in the industrial space, and with the little budget that we had, this is what we did. Created a continuous window that opens up to the mountain and to the sea. After that first loft, we were then hired by an artist to create his own loft. So now we did have a user that we can interact with and ask him what he liked or didn't like. But of course, that comes with a whole other set of problems. He wanted a space where he could work, live, and sell his art. And that involves having a party, because we know that in art gallery openings, that's when you sell your art in a 200 square meter space. He did not want a mezzanine. So we created a large catering space in his kitchen, a large living room space, and one low division between the living space, which is a working and selling space, and the sleeping space, let's say the bedroom. And here's a little video of the process of that project. So there we see the living room space, which is also the working space and the exhibition space, the large opening of the kitchen for when they have catering. The low partition between the bedroom and the living room space allows all the natural light to come in. There we see the bathroom. The project was very well received. It won a few awards and actually was very well published Back in 2015, we didn't have any social media. So we were tagged and there's like thousands of likes, but we weren't there. It was very, very fast how all these things happen. We of course now have our Instagram. You can follow us at Mass Operations. So that's the beginning of the office with interiors in Hong Kong. And now I'm going to move into the architecture side. But before we go into proper buildings, I want to show you a little bit of competitions, what we do with pavilions. And then I hope we can have time to discuss the two last projects that I'll show, which are the architecture projects that are not only built, but also deal in a much more direct with the smart allocation of resources, energy consumption, because of their scale and because of their manifestation as being built. No? Because with these projects, I show you how we think about design being a solver of problems and a generator of opportunities. This is a competition in Mexico City where we were asked to provide a pavilion that is recyclable, that is used for 2 weeks only. And we saw the site and we saw the opportunity to, with this pavilion, connect two plazas. What do I mean by that? We were only given $5,000 for a budget of construction. And when giving $5,000 as a budget and giving this site, this is the park in Mexico City, almost in the historical center. But the actual site is that alley back there, which used to be a road, which is now pedestrian, and is 2,500 square meters. So with $5,000, I mean, it's not really a pavilion that you can place along that road. You have to choose the middle or each corner. And that for us was very disappointing. We wanted to occupy the whole road. And with $5,000, you can't do that. It just, there's not enough material for that. So what we did was to split apart the pavilion into these frames, these 10 wooden frames that had what we call Hawaiian curtains, these plastic curtains that you sometimes see at butcher shops. And the idea was that once you see this frame with these curtains, they're a bit mysterious. You want to go through it. And when you go through one, you see 9 other ones. You're like, okay, well, let's go through all 9 to see what's on the other side of these frames. And in a hidden way, beneath these frames, there are these mats that take your energy of stepping through it and create it into electricity. So what we were doing was generating electricity with each step of the users. We had information from the call for this competition. There was going to be 50,000 people coming through the pavilion. So we calculated that, and we knew that we could provide electric energy for 6 houses for 1 year in Mexico. So we took it very seriously and did a mock-up of our proposed frame, a little bit smaller. We put it here in the patio of our office. There you can see it. I had quite a bit fun with it. It was a little bit smaller, a bit more narrower, because that was the only way it could fit through the service corridor. And we call it atraviesa, which means to go through. And because I think if you see this, it almost makes you think as a little child, where you desperately want to go through it to see what's on the other side. And we love that idea. These are some renderings of how the project would look on site. There, I think if you see one of these, you need to go through all of them. And off to one side, you can see the screen with a live count of the kilowatt hours being generated by walking through this. We were nominated as finalists, but unfortunately did not win. So we decided to come back to this competition next year. And then we decided to create a sculpture which would remind you, educate you, and inform you. This is a little bit cryptic. The issue is that between these 2 years, what happened in Mexico City was something very tragic, which is this.
Se cayeron edificios.
So I happened to be in Mexico City for that, during that earthquake, and lived through it. And we thought that there was nothing that we could speak about with this competition that did not have to do. We could only speak about the earthquake. I'm based out of Monterrey, but happened to be there that week. Thankfully, none of the people that I know or my loved ones, anything happened to them, but I thought that we needed to speak about the earthquake. And actually, I lost my flight going back to Asia and gave my first online class that year, way before we were doing this kind of sort of interaction. And the way we decided to speak about the earthquake was this way, with that earlier challenge that I mentioned. We took this building, which is an iconic building of Mexico, right in the historical center, right next to the site, which we saw as sort of a Mexico's Hagia Sophia, because this has survived all the earthquakes, 1985 earthquake, that same earthquake. And we said, what an interesting symbol of, endurance. So what if we take that building and break it? Now, the breaking was not mere shock value. It was really the theory behind the project. So here you see a view of that park. We take the image of this icon in Mexico City. We made a 3D print. We then did a clay model, which we broke, as you saw. And then we manipulated the debris of that model and threw it onto the park. We didn't respect the actual site that the competition gave us. We said, no, this is a bigger idea. Let's put these pieces of debris all through the park. And as we drop them metaphorically onto the park, we take away their identity, not their function, as I was talking about that fork and the art, but we take away their identity by pixelizing them. So you don't anymore recognize them as a debris, but you recognize them as actually as a piece of sculpture. But this piece of culture is actually a debris of the potential demolishing of this building under an earthquake. So once you find out what it's about, it serves to remind you that you live in a seismic zone and you need to be prepared for this seismic zone. So these were sculptures, they were not pavilions. After the 2 weeks, which the sculptures are deployed, then they're joined. 2 pieces joined to form one info pavilion. And because we had 10 pieces, so that's 5 pavilions that would go throughout the city permanently, not for 2 weeks only, as info points of how to be prepared for the next earthquake. The model is right behind me, actually. It's one of our favorite models in the office. And we did not get nominated for this one. We thought it was an even better project, but that's how competitions go. This is the last competition I'll show, and then we'll move on to 2 buildings. This is a landscape project that is very near to our hearts because there was a big controversy that generated it. Let me explain. This is a site. This is a green site near the historical center of Monterrey, which is where I'm based from. And the government proposed to create here a parking building. And so that prompted nonprofit citizens organizations to go there and camp on site and saying, you're not going to touch one single tree on this site. And it forced the government to change its plans, and it convened then a design competition for a park. We thought this was great energy and great thing to do, and we had to be involved. The competition was called the Citizens Park. So the first thing we did was interview the citizens. So here we went with Don Juan, and he said, well, what would you like around the park? And he told us, well, it should be well lit because it's a little bit dangerous at night. Other people told us that it should have water features. Don Armando told us that he had a pump that he could give us for the park. Michelle says that she likes some shade and some water features after lunch, some place to sit, so on and so on. So we developed this strategy of trying to join all those, let's say, yearnings and wantings of the citizens in this space and try to provide this design solution with one single element. This single element we bring into site, and that generates the different parts of the park with its different programs. This element is also the only green element, because with so many trees, we knew that grass was never going to grow here because of the shade. So we proposed what is a arcilla, it's not a hard surface. I forget it's a pebble park, not a grass park. So that element is a green element. The rest is all pebbles. And then we cut through it with a circulation space. This space is generating the cultural space, the children's space, and the adult spaces. That's the final form of the park. So here you see the cultural space, which takes use of the natural slope of the site. We created these seatings that could be then part of donations to create more money for the upkeep of the park, which is really important. Here you see the adult space in close connection to the children's spaces. The games look more like sculptures and not like death threats. Adult spaces with some chess sets and boards. and the circulation space. So there you see the operations, maintaining existing trees, one single element, which is green, pebble garden around, and slicing through the walkway. Oh, and by the way, the water feature from Don Armando is there. Again, we were finalists but did not win, and these are how competitions go. I like to show more of the competitions that we didn't win than the ones that we did win. And so I'm going to end with two projects that are architecture that are larger in scale. The first one, oh, sorry, hold on. This I had taken out. I don't think we're going to have time to see this one, so I'm going to skip ahead. I apologize for that. I thought I had taken this one out. Really sorry for this. Okay, the first one is a house. Sorry about that. The first one is a house where we said, what if a house could float? And you would say, well, what is the point of a house floating? Because we saw an opportunity to solve all these problems by making a house float. Eliminate dark floor plans, create the multiple levels that the client wanted, give security to the house, and create all the square meters, the density that the client wanted in the program. It also attacked two issues. This is the main issue here. Around this house in Monterrey, in the San Pedro district, these are the types of houses that you'll see. Now, I don't know what you think, but for me, this is first a house for a car and then for a human. These are first garages and then houses. And this is a big problem of how much we've relied on the car. It also connected with my ex-boss's first house, which is this one, La Villa Alba, outside of Paris, which elevated itself to gain a view of the Eiffel Tower, which you can see back there. So let me explain how we attack this. If we look at the building in plan, the larger the plan gets and it reaches its boundaries, the less amount of natural light you can get into that building. So the center becomes darker and darker. So then if you look at the building in elevation, what we did is to try to excavate a staircase to get to the upper story. But then we lifted that upper story to generate an extra level and sort of a light well, a horizontal light well through the whole of the building. And that also generates that mezzanine space, which the family actually didn't know what they wanted to do with that mezzanine space. They didn't ask for it, and they were quite surprised why they needed it. But sometimes as a designer, you need to tell your clients that they need to trust you. And you need to provide the arguments to generate that trust. And that's where drawings and storytelling is very important. So that's the diagram, and that's the rendering of the project. As you can see there, the staircase, the lifted floor, the main entrance volume. And here you see a model of the building. One concrete box on the bottom with its staircase, one concrete box floating on top. And here we can understand how that horizontal light well works. We bring in light from the street and from the garden all through that floor plan, which normally during the middle of the day would be dark. You would have to turn on lights. No lights are turned on here during the day. There we see a more developed section. And here are a few images of the house, a double height space where you see there Martha Stewart at her kitchen, the double height living room space, which opens fully to the garden. Here we see a 17-meter span with no columns. This was only possible by our collaboration with engineers. This is Stephen Melville, which helped us calculate this truss that works not only by itself, but also in conjunction with the whole building, which is swaying towards the street to pull this truss up so that it's the narrowest or the thinnest and the lightest possible. You have to understand that weight equals money, yes? So light equals cheap. Construction started in all steel. You can see the buildings around are all concrete and masonry. So this was quite a novelty for the neighbors, and they were really scared. So we had to put up renderings on the wall so that people knew what was being built here. They were really, really scared. But you can start seeing the spaces. This is double height living room space. This construction worker here is not very tall, but it's a good, comparison to the size of the space. The bridges start being built, and you can start seeing the views of the house. Steel work is almost like acrobatic in form, but concrete coming up coming down with the formwork is also quite beautiful in itself. And then again, the building starts to take shape. There's the living room space with that 17-meter span. I put this little video because only with human scale and with video can you really start to understand that space for a residential space for a very small lot, actually, only 500 square meters. So there we see the house. So actually, it's quite interesting to look at the facade because you see three levels here, and the two buildings next to it have 2 levels. So in a way, the proportions are very deceiving. So here, I'm going to skip through these images that we already saw in the video. Photos are always nicer than video, but video explains it a lot better. There we see the light coming all through the floor plan, from the street to the garden. Some of the bridges, we had fun and we put in some glass flooring to mark the transition from one space to another. There's the stair. Secondary bedroom with its bathroom, main bathroom, and there we go. Now I'm going to show the final project, which is the largest in scale and the most recent completion of the office, which is a headquarter company for a pharmaceutical here in Monterrey. It's a Mexican pharmaceutical company. They're a pharmaceutical retailer. The idea here was to create connected spaces, which for us are collaboration spaces. The problem here was that the client, a very large project with multiple clients, the site owner, the developer, and the people who are going to actually rent the space for 10 years. And they wanted a tower. And as an architect, when we think about towers, this is what we see, and we get really excited. But when we saw the site, which was this, we realized that it would be a tremendous problem to have a tower here because it's only a large facade to the western sun of Monterrey, which is terrible. Also, the idea of having a headquarter office where you have 500 employees amongst 30 floors is terrible. You want to have everybody on the same floor plate. So we didn't want to do this. And I have a little video. It is in Spanish, but it has subtitles where I explain this situation.
En un principio, cuando nos llega este proyecto a la oficina, nos llega como una torre de oficinas. Y claro que como arquitectos a todos nos gusta la idea de proyectar grandes edificios. Pero ya que tuvimos tiempo de analizar el proyecto y el sitio, nos dimos cuenta que hacer una torre de oficinas aquí sería un grave error, ya que lo único que estaríamos haciendo es proyectar una gran fachada hacia el sol del poniente de Monterrey. Además, este edificio de oficinas no es uno común y corriente donde hay muchos renteros, sino es un edificio donde hay un solo equipo trabajando en conjunto. Por lo tanto, analizamos las necesidades del cliente para este proyecto y encontramos que había 3 aspectos muy importantes que mantener. Uno es que todos los pisos estuvieran muy bien comunicados. El segundo es que creáramos espacios para hacer colaboración espontánea posible. Y tercero, era que en ningún momento un empleado preferiría tomar el elevador que subir escaleras para irse de un piso a otro. Entonces comenzamos con un volumen largo y bajo, el cual al levantarse se protege con una fachada de louver hacia el sol del poniente. Ese mismo volumen en planta lo abrimos desde su centro para así recibir toda la luz del norte, la cual es la mejor luz de trabajo. De tal manera, acabamos con un proyecto bajo, compacto, muy sustentable muy bien comunicado, en el cual desde su primero hasta sus últimos de sus niveles lo podemos navegar por medio de escaleras. Y es ahí, en esas escaleras, donde se da los momentos de colaboración espontánea.
So you can see it's a building that is working really hard, and we were fed up with losing competitions when we created buildings that had louvers on the outside. And then the client saying, oh, louvers are very expensive, and then going with another proposal by another architect, which didn't have louvers, and then wasting a lot of money in electricity, and then say, oh, we should have put up louvers. And so he said, yeah, you need them when you have such a large western-facing facade. So what we did was to bifurcate the plan in this sort of V or A-shaped plan, which what it causes is that half of the building is impacted by the western sun, but it projects a shade or a shadow to the other side of the building. So you use half of the louvers that you normally would have to use. And we use a lot less louvers than if we had gone vertical, yeah? And your team is articulated and only in 4 floor plans instead of being in 30. So there's many spaces to the building. It has a rooftop, it has a public plaza that the client didn't ask for. It has a pharmacy in the back, one of the retailer's own pharmacies. Here we see a few of the concept models, then one of the larger finalized models. And construction progress began. And it was a very interesting construction progress because we were able to build one half before the other one. It was a deep foundation with 3 underground parking levels. There you can see how they start to rise. And because the plan is bifurcated and you want the teams connected, how do you do that? You connect them through bridges so they don't have to take ever a lift. There we see the lobby space and the crowning 4th level, which perfectly frames La Huasteca Mountains. There we see some of the bridges. Here we see the ramp staircase being built. This is one of these spaces that we kept on arguing with the client, and the client kept saying it was too expensive, like, no, we need this. We need to gradually bring in pedestrians from the sidewalk up to that public plaza. We never called it public plaza because that would have scared our clients, but we generated almost a 800 square meter space that is completely accessible from the ground. And when they got built, we were actually very surprised it got built. And it was almost a 48-hour process from pouring and curing and then putting all the planters in place as such. The interior program is constantly being communicated to the outside. If you see louvers, it's a workspace. If you see just glass, it's a semi-public space like a lobby or a corridor, or in this case, with its outdoor space, the cafeteria for the whole building. There you see the pharmacy in the back. This building has no services on the roof. It's a green roof. There is colibris, which are hummingbirds. We have all natural, let's say, of the zone vegetation, anacahuitas and other plants there. And that was the day of the opening. That's a view of the lobby space. Still was not quite with all its finishes. You can see some temporary spaces there being filled with planters. But you had these kind of working spaces where you're protected from the western sun by 3 layers of your own building, no? But you can still see through them. And it's very, very green. And if you don't see green, you see the mountains. These articulation spaces are much more than just staircases. They're meeting spaces, they're working spaces. Nobody takes a lift here. Nobody wants to take a lift. And you create multiple environments for working, not only your desk, but you can work in any part of this building, including the rooftop. There we see a water mirror at the afternoon, the Huasteca in the background, the public plaza. That's a side view of the building. The building really reacts to its context. We didn't want to generate a 6 facade building, but we did because we generated the best facades for the best program and orientation. And with this, I'd like to conclude. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for that amazing presentation. We're going to open it up for questions. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to write in the chat or raise your Zoom hand and I can call on you to ask if you have any questions or comments.
I had seen some messages in the chat, but I don't know if that were from before. Oh, there we go. If you have a question. Yeah, I hope there's questions because these kind of engagements, what I enjoy most are the conversations.
Yeah, feel free to raise your little Zoom hand. Oh, Mark, it looks like Mark has a question. You can unmute yourself, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it very much for the well orchestrated, well choreographed presentation. Obviously, you're taking your studies of cinema very seriously in how you organize your own work, which was beautiful. My question is a little pedestrian maybe, but you know, I'm an educator. Been in education for 35 years. And the whole question of physical models and physical modeling it's bigger than just a matter of deciding, okay, we're going to work in a very experiential realm, we're going to get our fingers dirty, or we're going to work within the digital realm and keep our fingers clean. What do you find in your own practice or your teaching that allows the physical model to not be an object, but to be a process of thinking?
Yeah, thank you, Mark, for the comments and for the question. I think in education and then afterwards in your professional life, the model is a different thing in every stage and it has multiple layers and purposes. So academically, when I'm teaching earlier studios, I like to use a model in the case study phase. I like for students to look at a project and become like a very hardcore investigator of the project, to draw the plans and from the plans try to build a model so they can get to know in a very personal and intrinsic way the project and see why X or Y designer did X or Y decisions on the project. And you can only do that in a very sort of manual way of going very pragmatically, photos of the project, plans of the project, build the model. With the plans, you build the model. If you don't have plans, it's really hard to build that model. So in that sense, that model becomes the summation of that process. Then in a little bit more, let's say medium term studios, year 2, year 3, the model for me is a way of communicating the design. You know, many times students are grappling with learning the software for 3D modeling. And some are very quick, but some are very hesitant. Maybe they had a bad tutor at some point. Maybe they didn't pay attention at some point. And then all of a sudden they feel this wave of everybody passing them by and the ability to model and they're stuck. And that's a great student to then say, do it physically. Use what I call trash materials. Yeah, recycled paper, recycled cardboard, and try to manually create your design that you're trying to draw. My final project, year 5 in my bachelor studies, we had a very complicated site with gullies that were 30 meters tall. It was 30-hectare site. I can't do the acreage on it, but it was a very big site. And the only way I could get to understand how to manipulate the site was to then cover it in plaster and then break the plaster to understand the levels and to understand the heights that you can achieve. So I give those examples. Now, on the professional side, for me, the models do become objects at some point. The models that are behind there at that scale, they become an object of the building. They become a memory of the building. When we finalize a project in Spanish, we have the memoria, which is really the memory of what you've developed, designed, a booklet, a video, etc. They do become that in a way, but they shouldn't start like that. You need to be able to understand what the model can do for you. The model with the client is very important because they can actually see it. They can place themselves around, they can understand it. Many times we forget that we're architects and we understand plans, sections, and renderings. And clients, especially if this is the first time they're building something like their own house, They're not used to these sort of conversations. So models can be many, many things. And the key aspect is not to be reductionist about what the model can be and how it's used.
Thank you. It looks like Reza, you have a question. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah. Hey, Viviano. Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering why you, for breaking the Iosophia-like building, I don't know what you call that building. So why you didn't use intense seismic load instead of, I mean, that would be more realistic to use intense load to break that model.
Yes, well, that's a very technical question. Thank you, Reza. I've seen these, I don't know how to call them. They're these shaking tables that you place a model that's to appropriate scale and build to the according thicknesses to see how the building is going to react. But that's a very expensive thing to do. We did that with the CCTV building in Beijing, but with OMA, because the government hired, well, it's China. So CCTV is a public company. It's a government-run enterprise. They control what people in China see on TV. And so they hired all the structural engineers from the universities of China to then basically say the building didn't work. And so the way we proved it was through performance-based, which I love saying performance-based because I use that with my clients all the time. That's what we did on the louvers. We did the louvers through a performance-based design and said, look, you're saving this many kilograms on louvers, but don't take these away because you really need these. We could have done that. And what we did back then is we placed a huge model. It was like 5 meters tall and it shook and nothing fell. And so they say, okay, guys, so it works. I would have loved to be able to do that, but at that project, we did it 3 years ago, and there was not that much budget for that small pavilion competition. And I like to say also, I do say that we didn't break it for shock value. It was really about the concept, but the way we broke it and the image that we produce is a bit shocking, and we kind of like that too. It gets the point across. It's storytelling.
Thank you.
Thank you. It looks like we have time for one more question. Does anyone have a question? You can raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask. Okay. Well, it looks like we are coming to the end of the hour. As you can see, Kayla posted the link for the, oh, it looks like Kushagra, did you have a question? Oh, no, reaction, sorry. It looks like Kayla posted the link for the discussion board for Viviano. So feel free to continue the discussion there or post your questions there. And this recording will be uploaded a little later today. So if you weren't able to attend the session, you'll be able to go back and rewatch it and ask questions on the discussion board. I want to thank you again, Viviano, for that amazing presentation, and thank you for attending the conference. And thank you for everyone for attending, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference and viewing of the conference material. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.